Hello, and welcome to another journey into the shadows of history. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, we're going to embark on a voyage that will carry you across treacherous waters and into the heart of legend itself. We're going to tell the complete story of perhaps the most infamous pirate who ever lived, a man whose very name still sends shivers down the spine centuries after his death. We're going to discover the truth behind Edward Teach, better known to history as Blackbeard. Now, when you hear that name, what comes to mind? Perhaps you picture a wild-eyed monster with smoke literally rising from his hair, terrorizing helpless sailors on the high seas. Maybe you imagine buried treasure on some forgotten island, or dramatic sword fights on the rolling deck of a pirate ship. These images have been burned into our collective imagination by countless books and films. But tonight, we're going to peel back the layers of myth and legend to reveal the real man behind the fearsome reputation. The story of Blackbeard is not just the tale of one man's rise and fall. It's a window into an entire world, a brief and violent chapter in history when the very nature of power, authority, and freedom was being tested on the open seas. It's the story of how desperate times created desperate men, and how one particular man became the embodiment of every merchant's nightmare and every government's greatest challenge. But before we dive into the depths of this tale, I'd love to know where you are in the world as you listen to this story unfold. Are you drifting off to sleep in a cozy bedroom? Or perhaps you're lying awake in the early hours of the morning, unable to find rest? Whatever brings you here tonight, you're about to discover that the real Edward Teach was far more complex, far more human, and in many ways far more terrifying than any fictional pirate could ever be. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let the gentle sound of these words carry you back to a time when the ocean was truly wild, when the map of the world still had blank spaces, and when a single black flag could strike fear into the hearts of entire nations. This is the complete story of Blackbeard, told in full, and it begins not with the legendary pirate captain, but with an ordinary young man trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to crush him. Our story opens in the closing years of the 17th century, in the bustling port city of Bristol, England. The air here is thick with the smell of salt, tar, and human sweat. Ships from across the known world crowd the harbour, their masts creating a forest of wood and rope against the grey English sky. This is where we first encounter the man who would become Blackbeard, though at this time he was simply Edward Teach, probably no more than 20 years old, standing on the crowded docks with calloused hands and the lean, hungry look of someone who had known real poverty. Bristol, in those days, was England's second largest city, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the tides. It was here that ships departed for the American colonies, loaded with manufactured goods, and returned months later, heavy with tobacco, sugar, and other colonial treasures. But for every merchant who grew rich from this trade, there were hundreds of ordinary sailors who lived and died in the shadow of those profits, earning barely enough to survive between voyages. Edward Teach was one of these forgotten men. We know frustratingly little about his early life, but we can piece together a likely picture from what we understand about young men in his position. He was probably born somewhere in the West Country of England, possibly around 1680, though some sources suggest he might have been born in the American colonies themselves. What we do know is that by the time he appears in the historical record, he was already a seasoned sailor, which means he must have gone to sea while still a boy. Imagine what that life must have been like. A child of perhaps 12 or 13, torn from whatever family he might have had, thrust into the brutal world of an 18th century merchant ship. The work was backbreaking, the food was rotten, the discipline was savage, and death was a constant companion. Yet somehow Edward Teach not only survived, but thrived in this harsh environment. He learned to read the wind and the waves, to navigate by the stars, to handle both sail and sword with equal skill. But survival in that world required more than just physical strength and seamanship. It required a certain hardness, a willingness to do whatever was necessary to stay alive. The young Edward Teach was learning lessons that would serve him well in the years to come. Lessons about power, about loyalty, about the thin line between order and chaos that exists aboard any ship. As the new century dawned, Edward Teach found himself caught up in events far larger than any individual sailor. England was at war, as it so often was in those days, locked in a bitter struggle with France and Spain that would rage across oceans and continents. This was the War of Spanish Succession, though to the sailors who fought in it, the politics mattered less than the simple fact that it meant work, danger, and opportunity in equal measure. It was during this war that Edward Teach first tasted the life that would eventually consume him. Like thousands of other sailors, he was recruited or perhaps pressed into service aboard a privateer, one of the armed merchant ships that governments licensed to attack enemy commerce. Privateering was perfectly legal, sanctioned by official documents called letters of marque that gave captains the right to capture enemy ships and sell their cargoes for profit. But there was always a thin line between privateering and outright piracy, and that line became even thinner when you were hundreds of miles from the nearest government official, alone on the vast ocean with nothing but your own conscience and the loyalty of your crew to guide you. For young Edward Teach, serving aboard these privateers was like attending a masterclass in organized violence and the art of taking what you wanted by force. The privateers operated primarily in the Caribbean, that warm chain of islands that had become the crossroads of the Atlantic world. Here, Spanish treasure ships laden with silver from the mines of Peru would make their slow way back to Europe. Here, English and French sugar plantations produced wealth beyond imagination, worked by the sweat and blood of enslaved Africans. And here, in the hidden coves and secluded harbours of 100 islands, men like Edward Teach learned the skills that would make them the terror of the seas. We can imagine him during these years, growing from a young sailor into a formidable fighting man. He was tall for his time, probably well over 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and powerful arms that came from years of hauling on heavy ropes and wielding cutlass and pistol. His hair was black and grew long and wild, and he had begun to cultivate the fearsome beard that would eventually give him his famous nickname. But more than his physical presence, it was his mind that set him apart. Edward Teach was learning to read men as well as he could read the sea. He understood that fear was often more powerful than actual violence, that the right reputation could open more doors than the sharpest sword. He was watching and learning from the captains he served under, studying their successes and their failures, and slowly forming his own ideas about how a ship should be run and how men should be led. The war years also taught him something else crucial about the nature of authority and law. He saw how quickly legal privateers could become illegal pirates the moment peace was declared, how the same actions that were praised and rewarded in wartime suddenly became crimes punishable by death in peacetime. He learned that morality was often just a matter of perspective, and that survival sometimes required a willingness to ignore the rules that other men lived by. But perhaps most importantly, these years in the Caribbean introduced him to a community of sailors who shared his experiences and his outlook. These were men who had grown comfortable with violence, who had tasted the intoxicating freedom that came from taking what they wanted rather than begging for what they needed. They were men who had learned to distrust authority and to rely only on each other. When the War of Spanish Succession finally ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht, thousands of these experienced fighting sailors suddenly found themselves unemployed. The great naval fleets were reduced, the privateer commissions were cancelled, and men who had spent years as legal raiders were suddenly expected to return to the grinding poverty of peacetime merchant service. For many, this transition proved impossible. They had grown too accustomed to the freedom and the profits of their wartime life to accept the return to legal drudgery. And so, in the years following the peace, many of these former privateers made a fateful decision. If they could no longer legally prey upon enemy shipping, they would continue to do so illegally. If the war had ended for their governments, it would continue for them. This was the beginning of what historians call the Golden Age of Piracy, roughly the decade from 1715 to 1725, when pirate crews terrorized shipping lanes from the Caribbean to the coasts of North America and even across the Atlantic to the shores of West Africa. And at the center of this golden age, growing in power and reputation with each passing month, was the man who had once been plain Edward Teach, but was now becoming something far more dangerous. It was probably sometime around 1716 that Edward Teach made his final transition from legal sailor to outright pirate. The exact circumstances are lost to history, but we can imagine the moment when he finally decided that he had had enough of taking orders from men he didn't respect, enough of working for wages that barely kept him alive, enough of living by rules made by people who had never set foot on a ship's deck. Perhaps it was a particularly brutal captain who pushed him too far, or maybe it was simply the sight of a heavily laden merchant ship sailing fat and slow across his path. Whatever the trigger, the decision once made was irreversible. Edward Teach had chosen to step outside the law, to become one of those men who lived by their own rules and answered to no authority but their own. But he was not alone in making this choice. All across the Caribbean, small groups of desperate sailors were making the same decision, banding together into crews that would soon become the stuff of legend and nightmare. These were not the romantic adventurers of later fiction, but hard, practical men, driven by hunger, anger, and a burning desire for the freedom and respect that the legal world had denied them. The early days of Edward Teach's piratical career remain shrouded in the mists of time, but we know that he did not begin as a captain. Like most men who would eventually command their own vessels, he started as a member of someone else's crew, learning the dark arts of his new profession under the guidance of more experienced pirates. The man who would become his mentor was Benjamin Hornigold, a seasoned pirate captain who operated out of Nassau in the Bahamas. Nassau at this time was less a proper town than a sprawling encampment of outcasts and rogues, a place where the rule of law had completely broken down and been replaced by the rough justice of the pirate brotherhood. Here, among the ramshackle taverns and makeshift shelters that lined the harbour, Edward Teach found his true education. Hornigold was a shrewd judge of character, and he quickly recognised something special in the tall, black-bearded sailor who had joined his crew. Teach had a natural authority about him, a way of commanding respect, without having to raise his voice or draw his sword. Men listened when he spoke, and more importantly, they trusted his judgment in the heat of battle. These were invaluable qualities in a world where a captain's life depended on the loyalty of his crew. Under Hornigold's tutelage, Teach learned the finer points of piratical strategy. It was one thing to know how to fight, quite another to know when to fight and when to use other means to achieve your goals. The most successful pirates, Hornigold taught him, were not necessarily the most violent, but the most intelligent. A reputation for ruthless efficiency could often accomplish more than actual ruthless efficiency, and a wise captain knew how to cultivate such a reputation without unnecessarily spilling blood. Teach proved to be an excellent student. He participated in numerous raids during his time with Hornigold's crew, always distinguishing himself through his courage, his tactical thinking, and his ability to inspire confidence in his fellow pirates. He began to develop the theatrical instincts that would later serve him so well, understanding that piracy was as much about performance as it was about violence. But perhaps more importantly, he was learning about the delicate politics that governed pirate society. The Caribbean in those days was home to dozens of different pirate crews, each with their own territory, their own methods, and their own ambitions. Some crews were willing to cooperate with others, forming loose alliances for mutual benefit. Others were fiercely territorial, attacking anyone who ventured into their claimed waters. Navigation through this complex web of relationships required diplomatic skills that few people outside the pirate world ever suspected these outlaws possessed. It was during this period that Edward Teach began to cultivate the image that would eventually make him the most feared pirate of his age. He started growing his beard out to an extraordinary length, weaving hemp and ribbons into the coarse black hair until it became a magnificent and terrifying spectacle. Before going into battle, he would light slow-burning matches and tuck them under his hat, so that his head would be wreathed in smoke like some demon rising from the depths of hell. But the beard and the theatrics were just the surface manifestations of a much deeper transformation. The young sailor who had once taken orders without question was becoming a natural leader, a man who could inspire absolute loyalty in some and paralyzing fear in others. His voice, when raised in anger or command, could cut through the chaos of battle like a blade through silk. His eyes, dark and penetrating, seemed to see straight through to a man's soul, measuring his worth and his weaknesses in a single glance. By 1717, Teach had so distinguished himself that Hornigold began giving him command of captured vessels, allowing him to lead his own raids while still operating under the older captain's overall authority. This was a crucial step in any pirate's career, the moment when he proved that he could not only follow orders but give them effectively. Teach passed this test with flying colours, demonstrating both the tactical acumen and the leadership skills that marked him as captain material. His first independent command was a small sloop, probably captured from some unfortunate merchant and converted for piratical use. With a crew of perhaps 30 men, most of them drawn from Hornigold's larger company, Teach began to make his own mark on the Caribbean waters. His early raids were modest affairs, targeting small merchant vessels and coastal settlements that could be taken without too much risk or bloodshed. But even in these early days, there were signs of the fearsome reputation he was building. Stories began to circulate among sailors and merchants about a tall pirate captain with a magnificent black beard who could appear out of nowhere like a ghost ship, strike with devastating efficiency, and vanish again before any pursuit could be organized. The name they gave him was simple but effective: Blackbeard. What made these early stories so compelling was not just their dramatic content, but the grain of truth that ran through them. Teach was indeed a master of surprise, using his intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters to appear where he was least expected. He had a talent for choosing his targets carefully, striking at vessels that were rich enough to make the raid worthwhile, but not so well defended that the attack would be costly in lives and ammunition. More importantly, he was developing a sophisticated understanding of the psychology of piracy. He realized that his reputation could be his most powerful weapon, that the mere sight of his distinctive black flag could sometimes cause a merchant crew to surrender without firing a shot. Every story that was aggravated tale of his fee told about him. Every exrosity and cunning made his job easier by increasing the fear that preceded him into every encounter. But reputation alone was not enough to ensure success in the cutthroat world of Caribbean piracy. The region was becoming increasingly crowded with competing crews, and the easy targets were becoming harder to find. Colonial governments, responding to pressure from merchant interests, were beginning to take stronger measures against piracy. Naval patrols were becoming more frequent and more aggressive, and the safe havens that pirates had once taken for granted were starting to disappear. It was in this changing environment that Teach made the decision that would define the rest of his career. Rather than continue as a subordinate captain under Hornigold's authority, he would strike out entirely on his own, gathering his own crew and establishing himself as an independent force in the piratical world. It was a bold move that carried enormous risks, but also the potential for enormous rewards. The break with Hornigold came sometime in late 1717, and while the exact circumstances are unclear, it seems to have been amicable. The older captain had taught his protégé well, and he recognized that Teach had outgrown the role of subordinate. Perhaps he even saw in the younger man's ambition a reflection of his own earlier hunger for independence and command. With his own ship and his own crew, the man now known throughout the Caribbean as Blackbeard was of what free to pursue his vision piracy could become. He was no longer content to be just another raider preying on merchant shipping. He had grander ambitions, dreams of building something that resembled a maritime empire, with himself as its undisputed ruler. The first step in realizing these ambitions was to acquire a ship worthy of his growing reputation. The small sloop that had served him well in his early independent raids was no longer adequate for his purposes. He needed something larger, more heavily armed, capable of striking fear into the hearts of even well-defended merchant convoys. And in the autumn of 1717, fortune presented him with exactly what he was looking for. The ship was a French slave vessel called La Concorde, making its way through Caribbean waters with a cargo of human misery bound for the sugar plantations of the West Indies. It was a substantial vessel, over 100 feet in length and capable of mounting 40 guns, exactly the kind of ship that could serve as the flagship of a pirate fleet. More importantly, it was sailing alone, separated from any convoy or escort, making it vulnerable to the kind of swift, decisive attack that Blackbeard had perfected. The capture of La Concorde was a masterpiece of piratical strategy, demonstrating all the skills that Teach had learned during his years of apprenticeship. Rather than simply overwhelming the French ship with brute force, he orchestrated a complex operation that involved deception, superior seamanship, and precise timing. By the time the French captain realized what was happening, it was far too late to mount any effective resistance. The attack itself was swift and decisive. Blackbeard approached La Concorde flying false colors, appearing to be nothing more than another merchant vessel seeking safe passage through these dangerous waters. By the time the French crew realized their mistake, Teach's men were already swarming over their railings, cutlasses gleaming in the Caribbean sun. The French captain, faced with overwhelming odds and no hope of escape, had little choice but to surrender his vessel and his cargo. But what happened next revealed something crucial about the kind of leader Blackbeard was becoming. Rather than simply slaughtering the defeated crew, as many pirates might have done, he offered them a choice. Those who wished to join his company would be welcomed as brothers, with full shares in future plunder and equal voice in the crew's decisions. Those who preferred to return to their former lives would be given a smaller vessel and allowed to sail away unharmed. This was not mere mercy, though Teach was capable of surprising compassion when it served his purposes. It was calculated policy, designed to serve multiple strategic goals. First, it provided him with experienced sailors to help crew his new flagship, men who understood the vessel's peculiarities and could help him get the most out of her. Second, it sent a message throughout the Caribbean that Blackbeard, unlike some of his more bloodthirsty colleagues, was a man who could be reasoned with, who honored the ancient codes of maritime warfare. Most importantly, it demonstrated to his own crew that their captain was not a mindless killer driven by bloodlust, but a thoughtful strategist who understood that reputation and fear were more valuable than random violence. The men who sailed under Blackbeard's flag knew that their captain was capable of terrible violence when necessary, but they also knew that he would not waste their lives unnecessarily or expose them to pointless risks. With La Concorde, now his flagship, Teach set about transforming her from a slave ship into the most feared pirate vessel in the Caribbean. He renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, a name that proclaimed both his defiance of authority and his grandiose ambitions. The ship was extensively modified, with additional gun ports cut into her hull to accommodate the 40 cannons that would make her a floating fortress capable of overwhelming any merchant vessel and holding her own against all but the most powerful naval ships. But the physical transformation of the ship was only part of Blackbeard's grand design. He was also working to transform himself from a successful pirate captain into something approaching a maritime emperor. The theatrical elements that had always been part of his persona were refined and amplified until they became essential components of his strategic arsenal. The famous beard grew even longer and more magnificent, carefully maintained and decorated with ribbons and small braids that caught the light when he moved. Before battle, he would weave slow-burning hemp matches into his hair and beard, creating a wreath of smoke that made him appear like some supernatural being risen from the depths of hell itself. His clothing became more elaborate, featuring expensive fabrics captured from merchant ships and cut in a style that proclaimed his status as a man who answered to no earthly authority. More importantly, he began to surround himself with the trappings of power that would make his claims to authority seem legitimate. He established what amounted to a court, complete with officers who bore grandiose titles and performed ceremonial functions that elevated piracy from mere banditry to something resembling statecraft. His quartermaster became his chief minister, his sailing master, his admiral, his surgeon, his court physician. This was not mere vanity or theatrical display, though those elements were certainly present. Blackbeard understood that in a world where authority derived from perception as much as from actual power, the symbols of legitimacy were almost as important as the substance. By surrounding himself with the ceremonial trappings of kingship, he was making a claim that his rule over the seas was as valid as any monarch's rule over land. The crew of Queen Anne's Revenge grew rapidly as word spread of Blackbeard's success and his fair treatment of those who served under him. Unlike many pirate captains who ruled through fear and brutality, Teach understood that loyalty freely given was far more valuable than obedience extracted through terror. His men followed him not because they were afraid of him, though many certainly were, but because they believed in his vision and trusted in his ability to make them all rich. This loyalty was earned through Blackbeard's careful attention to the details of shipboard life that other captains often ignored. He ensured that his crew was well fed, well armed, and fairly compensated for their risks. When prizes were taken, the division of spoils followed the democratic principles that governed most pirate crews, with every man receiving his agreed-upon share according to his rank and contribution. No one could accuse Blackbeard of cheating his men or of claiming more than his due from their common ventures. But perhaps most importantly, he created an atmosphere aboard Queen Anne's Revenge that combined military discipline with a spirit of brotherhood that was rare in that harsh age. His crew knew that they could depend on each other in battle, that their captain would not abandon them in danger, and that their service would be rewarded not just with gold, but with respect and recognition. As 1717 drew to a close, Blackbeard's reputation had spread far beyond the Caribbean waters where he operated. Stories of his exploits reached the coffeehouses of London, the counting houses of Boston, and the royal courts of Europe. Colonial governors wrote urgent dispatches to their superiors, warning of the growing threat posed by this new breed of pirate, who seemed to combine the tactical skills of a naval commander with the ruthless efficiency of a professional criminal. What made these reports so alar Blackbeard's operations? But their aim was not just the scale of increasing boldness and sophistication. Unlike earlier pirates who had contented themselves with attacking isolated merchant vessels, Teach was beginning to challenge the very foundations of colonial commerce and imperial authority. His raids were becoming more ambitious, his targets more significant, his impact ruptive. The winter on maritime trade, Maudis months of 1717 and early 1718 saw a dramatic escalation in both the frequency and the audacity of Blackbeard's attacks. Operating primarily out of Nassau in the Bahamas, which had become a virtual pirate republic beyond the reach of any effective governmental control, he began to coordinate his activities with other pirate captains in what amounted to a loose confederation of maritime outlaws. This cooperation between different pirate crews was something relatively new in the Caribbean, and it multiplied their effectiveness enormously. Where a single pirate ship might be able to capture one or two merchant vessels before word of its presence spread and defensive measures were taken, a coordinated fleet of pirate vessels could sweep through entire shipping lanes, overwhelming escorts and capturing whole convoys before any effective response could be organized. Blackbeard proved to be a master of this new style of collaborative piracy. His natural charisma and proven track record made him a natural leader among the pirate captains who gathered in Nassau's taverns to plan their operations. Men who might have been rivals or enemies in other circumstances found themselves drawn into his orbit, convinced that they could achieve more by working with him than by competing against him. The most significant of these alliances was with a captain known as Stede Bonnet, a gentleman pirate whose story was almost as remarkable as Blackbeard's own. Bonnet was a wealthy Barbadian planter who had abandoned his comfortable life to seek adventure on the high seas, purchasing his own ship and recruiting his own crew in what may have been the only case of a man literally buying his way into piracy. Bonnet's motivations remained mysterious to his contemporaries and continue to puzzle historians today. Unlike most pirates, who were driven to their profession by poverty, oppression, or lack of alternatives, Bonnet seemed to have chosen piracy as a form of midlife crisis, abandoning a successful plantation and a comfortable family life for the uncertain rewards and constant dangers of life under the Black Flag. Whatever his reasons, Bonnet proved to be an ineffective pirate captain, lacking both the nautical skills and the leadership qualities necessary for success in that demanding profession. His crew, sensing weakness, became increasingly mutinous, and his raids were marked more by confusion and failure than by the decisive victories that characterized successful piratical operations. It was at this point that fate brought Bonnet into Blackbeard's sphere of influence. The two captains encountered each other in Nassau, where Bonnet's obvious incompetence and his crew's barely concealed contempt for their captain presented Teach with an opportunity that was too good to pass up. In a masterful display of political maneuvering, Blackbeard managed to convince Bonnet to place his ship and crew under Teach's overall command, ostensibly as a temporary measure to help the gentleman pirate learn the finer points of his chosen profession. In reality, this arrangement gave Blackbeard effective control of 2 ships and nearly 200 men, making him one of the most powerful pirate commanders in the Caribbean. Bonnet, flattered by the attention of such a famous pirate, and perhaps relieved to be freed from the burden of actual command, accepted a largely ceremonial role, while Blackbeard's trusted lieutenants took over the practical management of his vessel and crew. This expansion of his fleet coincided with a dramatic escalation in the scale and ambition of Blackbeard's operations. No longer content to prey on individual merchant ships or small coastal settlements, he began to contemplate attacks on major ports and heavily defended targets that had previously been considered beyond the reach of piratical assault. The first indication of this new level of ambition came in early 1718, when Blackbeard began to gather intelligence about the defenses of Charleston, the principal port of South Carolina and one of the most important commercial centers in the American colonies. Charleston was a heavily fortified city, protected by both natural barriers and man-made defenses, garrisoned by regular troops and defended by several armed vessels. It was exactly the kind of target that conventional pirate wisdom suggested should be avoided. But Blackbeard was no conventional pirate, and his assessment of Charleston's vulnerabilities was based on a sophisticated understanding of colonial politics and military realities that few of his contemporaries possessed. He recognized that for all its apparent strength, Charleston was fundamentally dependent on maritime commerce for its survival and prosperity. The city's wealth came from its role as a conduit between the agricultural riches of the Carolina backcountry and the markets of Europe and the Caribbean. More importantly, he understood that the city's defenses, impressive as they appeared on paper, were not designed to deal with the kind of unconventional warfare that he was prepared to wage. Charleston's fortifications were built to repel direct assault by conventional naval forces, not to deal with the enemy who might choose to strangle the city's commerce rather than attack its walls. The plan that Blackbeard began to develop during the early months of 1718 was audacious in its scope and revolutionary in its implications. Rather than simply raiding Charleston's shipping, he would blockade the entire port, cutting off all maritime traffic and bringing the city's economic life to a complete standstill. It was a strategy that anticipated the naval blockades that would become common during the great wars of the 19th and 20th centuries, but applied by a pirate commander with a tiny fleet against one of colonial America's most important cities. The psychological impact of such an operation would be enormous, demonstrating that no colonial settlement, no matter how well defended or how important, was beyond the reach of pirate power. It would establish Blackbeard not merely as a successful raider, but as a force capable of challenging the fundamental structures of imperial authority in the New World. But the Charleston operation would require more than just audacity and superior seamanship. It would demand careful planning, precise timing, and a level of coordination between different elements of his force that would test all of Blackbeard's skills as a strategist and leader. Most crucially, it would require him to maintain the loyalty and discipline of his crew during what might be a prolonged operation with uncertain rewards. As the spring of 1718 approached, Blackbeard began the careful preparations that would make his assault on Charleston possible. Ships were careened and their hulls cleaned to ensure maximum speed and maneuverability. Weapons were inspected and repaired, ammunition stockpiles were replenished, and provisions were gathered for what might be an extended campaign. Most importantly, the crews of his small fleet were drilled and trained until they could execute complex maneuvers with the precision of a regular naval squadron. The man who had once been plain Edward Teach, an ordinary sailor scrambling for survival in the harsh world of 18th century maritime commerce, had transformed himself into something unprecedented in the annals of piracy. He was no longer merely a successful raider or even a charismatic leader of desperate men. He had become a strategic thinker, capable of conceiving and executing operations that challenged the very foundations of imperial power in the Atlantic world. But with this transformation came new dangers and new responsibilities that would test every aspect of his character and abilities. The higher he climbed, the more enemies he accumulated, and the greater the forces that would eventually be marshaled against him. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not only Blackbeard's fate, but the future of piracy itself in the waters of the New World. The preparations for the Charleston operation revealed the full extent of Blackbeard's transformation, from mere pirate captain to something approaching a naval commander. In the hidden coves and secluded beaches of the Bahamas, his fleet underwent modifications that would have impressed the admiralty of any European power. Queen Anne's Revenge was fitted with additional swivel guns that could sweep her decks clear of boarders, while her hull was reinforced to withstand the kind of sustained combat that a blockade operation might require. But perhaps more significantly, Blackbeard began to implement new systems of communication and coordination that would allow his scattered vessels to operate as a unified force across the wide waters off Charleston Harbor. Signal flags were standardized, recognition codes were established, and contingency plans were developed for every conceivable situation that might arise during the operation. The crews themselves were subjected to a level of training and discipline that was unprecedented in the pirate world. Unlike the casual, almost haphazard approach that characterized most piratical operations, Blackbeard insisted on rigorous practice in the complex maneuvers that would be required to maintain an effective blockade. His men learned to coordinate their movements with mathematical precision, to respond instantly to signals from the flagship, and to maintain their positions, even in the face of determined opposition. This intensive preparation served multiple purposes beyond the immediate tactical requirements of the Charleston operation. It forged Blackbeard's disparate crews into a cohesive fighting force, united by shared training and common purpose. Men who had come from different backgrounds, different ships, and different traditions of seamanship were molded into a single instrument of maritime warfare. More subtly, the training process also served to reinforce Blackbeard's authority and to demonstrate his vision of what piracy could become. His crews were not merely learning new techniques of naval combat, they were being indoctrinated into a new conception of their profession. They were no longer simple raiders or opportunistic thieves, but soldiers in a war against the established order of the Atlantic world. As the final preparations neared completion, Blackbeard faced a crucial decision about the timing of his assault. Charleston's maritime traffic followed predictable seasonal patterns, with certain times of year seeing much heavier shipping than others. The spring months traditionally marked the beginning of the busiest period, as merchants rushed to move their accumulated winter inventories and planters prepared to ship their tobacco crops to European markets. This seasonal timing would maximize the economic impact of a blockade, but it would also mean that Charleston's defenses would be at their highest state of alert. The city's authorities were well aware of the increased pirate activity during the busy shipping season, and they typically reinforced their harbour patrols and coastal defences accordingly. After careful consideration, Blackbeard chose to proceed with the operation in late May of 1718, calculating that the potential rewards justified the increased risks. The decision revealed both his confidence in his preparations and his understanding of the psychological factors that would determine the operation's ultimate success. A blockade that began during the height of the shipping season would have immediate and dramatic effects that would be impossible for colonial authorities to ignore or minimize. The fleet that departed Nassau in the third week of May 1718 was unlike anything that had ever sailed under pirate colors. Queen Anne's Revenge led the formation, her black hull cutting through the azure waters of the Caribbean with the purposeful grace of a predator approaching its prey. Behind her came three smaller vessels, each carefully selected for the specific role it would play in the coming operation. The crews that manned these ships represented a cross-section of the maritime world's dispossessed and disenfranchised. Former naval sailors who had grown tired of the brutal discipline and meagre rewards of legitimate service sailed alongside merchant seamen who had been pushed beyond endurance by tyrannical captains and dishonest owners. There were escaped indentured servants from the tobacco plantations of Virginia, runaway slaves from the sugar islands of the Caribbean, and even a few gentlemen adventurers like Stede Bonnet, who had chosen this dangerous life for reasons that remained mysterious even to themselves. What united these disparate men was not merely their common outlaw status, but their shared belief in Blackbeard's vision of what they could accomplish together. They had seen him transform a captured slave ship into a floating fortress, organize scattered pirate crews into a disciplined fleet, and now prepare to challenge one of the most important cities in colonial America. Under his leadership, they had come to believe that anything was possible. The voyage from Nassau to Charleston took the better part of a week, during which Blackbeard maintained the fiction that his fleet was engaged in ordinary commerce raiding. His ships spread out across a wide area, maintaining the appearance of independent operators, while actually following a carefully coordinated plan that would bring them together at the precise moment when the blockade was to begin. During these final days before the operation commenced, Blackbeard spent hours in his cabin, poring over captured charts and merchant correspondence that provided crucial intelligence about Charleston's defenses and shipping patterns. He studied the reports of previous raids on the city, analyzing both their successes and their failures to identify lessons that might inform his own strategy. The picture that emerged from this intelligence was of a city that was both wealthy and vulnerable, protected by impressive-looking fortifications that were not designed to deal with the kind of unconventional warfare he was planning to wage. Charleston's defenses were oriented toward repelling direct assault by conventional naval forces, not toward maintaining the complex patrol schedules that would be necessary to break a determined blockade. More importantly, the city's political and military leadership appeared to be divided and uncertain, lacking both the unity of command and the strategic vision that would be necessary to mount an effective response to an unprecedented threat. The civilian authorities were primarily concerned with protecting their commercial interests, while the military commanders were focused on defending the city's physical infrastructure. This division of authority and purpose would be one of Blackbeard's greatest advantages in the coming confrontation. while his own forces operated under unified command, with clearly defined objectives. Charleston's defenders would be handicapped by competing priorities and unclear chains of command. As his fleet approached the Carolina coast, Blackbeard made his final preparations for what would be either his greatest triumph or his most spectacular failure. The operation he was about to launch would test every aspect of his leadership, from his tactical skills to his ability to maintain discipline among his crews during a prolonged and potentially frustrating campaign. On the morning of May 22, 1718, the citizens of Charleston awoke to discover that their city was under siege. Not the traditional siege of armies and artillery that their grandfathers might have recognized, but something entirely new in the annals of warfare. A pirate fleet had taken position outside their harbor, and no vessel could enter or leave without running the gauntlet of Blackbeard's guns. The psychological impact of this development was immediate and profound. Charleston was a city that lived by maritime commerce, and the sudden cessation of all shipping struck at the very foundations of its existence. Merchants watched helplessly as their vessels sat idle at the docks, their cargoes rotting in the humid Carolina heat. Ship captains found themselves prisoners in their own port, unable to fulfill contracts or meet delivery schedules that represented months of careful planning. But the physical presence of the pirate fleet was only part of Blackbeard's strategy. He understood that the true battle would be fought in the realm of psychology and politics, where fear and uncertainty could accomplish more than all the cannons in his arsenal. Within hours of establishing his blockade, he began a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare designed to maximize the pressure on Charleston's authorities. Captured vessels were brought close enough to the harbor mouth that their fates could be observed from the city's waterfront. Some were released after being stripped of their most valuable cargo, their crews bearing messages that emphasized Blackbeard's power and his willingness to negotiate. Others were burned in full view of the city, the columns of smoke serving as dramatic reminders of what resistance might cost. Most effective of all were the stories that began to circulate about Blackbeard himself. Eyewitness accounts from captured sailors described a figure of almost supernatural menace, wreathed in smoke and commanding his crews with a combination of charisma and terror that seemed to transcend ordinary human authority. These stories, embellished with each retelling, created an atmosphere of dread that pervaded the entire city. The economic effects of the blockade were felt almost immediately. Ships that had been expected to arrive with crucial supplies were either captured or turned away, creating shortages of everything from manufactured goods to basic foodstuffs. More seriously, the vessels that should have been carrying Charleston's tobacco and rice to European markets remained trapped in the harbor, representing millions of dollars in lost revenue and broken contracts. The city's political leadership found itself facing a crisis for which there was no precedent and no established protocol. The colonial governor lacked both the naval forces and the legal authority to mount an effective response to Blackbeard's unprecedented challenge. Appeals to neighboring colonies for assistance met with sympathy but little concrete support, as other colonial authorities were reluctant to weaken their own defenses by sending ships to Charleston's aid. Meanwhile, Blackbeard maintained his position with the patience and discipline of the experienced military commander. His ships took turns on patrol duty, ensuring that the blockade remained effective while preventing his crews from becoming exhausted or demoralized. Captured supplies were carefully rationed, and strict discipline was maintained to prevent the kind of indiscriminate violence that might have turned public opinion even more strongly against the pirates. As the blockade entered its second week, the pressure on Charleston's authorities reached a critical point. The city's merchant community, facing financial ruin, began to demand that some accommodation be reached with the pirates. Public meetings grew increasingly heated as citizens debated whether to continue resistance or to seek terms that might end their ordeal. It was at this moment of maximum pressure that Blackbeard revealed the true genius of his strategy. Rather than demanding the impossible surrender of the city or the payment of an enormous ransom that could never be raised, he presented Charleston's authorities with a relatively modest demand: that highlighted both his practical intelligence and his understanding of colonial politics. The demand, delivered through a captured merchant captain, who was released specifically for this purpose, was both shocking in its audacity and reasonable in its scope. Blackbeard wanted neither gold nor territory, but something far more valuable in the long term. He demanded a chest of medicines for his crews, official recognition of his authority over the waters around Charleston, and most significantly, a formal pardon from the colonial government for himself and his men. This demand revealed the sophisticated political thinking that lay behind Blackbeard's theatrical persona. He understood that his greatest vulnerability was not military defeat, which his superior seamanship and firepower made unlikely, but political isolation. A pirate who operated entirely outside the law could be hunted by every colonial government and naval force in the Atlantic world. But a pirate who had achieved some form of official recognition, however grudging, would have a degree of legitimacy that would complicate any future efforts to suppress him. The demand for medicines was particularly shrewd, as it addressed a genuine need while also demonstrating Blackbeard's concern for the welfare of his crews. Tropical diseases were the greatest killer of sailors in the Caribbean, and access to proper medical supplies could mean the difference between life and death for men operating far from conventional medical care. Charleston's authorities found themselves facing an impossible choice. To grant Blackbeard's demands would set a dangerous precedent that might encourage other pirates to attempt similar operations. But to refuse would mean the continuation of a blockade that was destroying the city's economy and threatening its very survival as a major commercial center. After days of heated debate and desperate consultation with authorities in London and other colonial capitals, Charleston's leadership made the fateful decision to negotiate with the pirates. It was a choice that would have profound implications not only for the immediate crisis, but for the future of piracy in American waters. The negotiations themselves were conducted with a formality that would have been appropriate for discussions between sovereign powers. Blackbeard appointed representatives to speak on his behalf, while Charleston's authorities selected their most skilled diplomats to represent the city's interests. The talks took place aboard a neutral vessel anchored in the harbour mouth, with both sides maintaining the elaborate courtesies that marked 18th century diplomacy. What emerged from these negotiations was an agreement that satisfied neither side completely, but provided both with enough face-saving elements to make acceptance possible. Charleston would provide the requested medicines and would issue a form of limited recognition that fell short of an official pardon, but acknowledged Blackbeard's de facto control over local waters. In return, the pirates would lift their blockade and would refrain from attacking Charleston shipping for a specified period. The conclusion of the Charleston blockade marked the pinnacle of Blackbeard's career and the moment when he achieved a level of power and recognition that no pirate before or since has equaled. For nearly 2 weeks, he had held one of colonial America's most important cities hostage, forcing its authorities to negotiate with him as though he were the representative of a legitimate government. But success of this magnitude inevitably attracted attention from forces far more powerful than any colonial government. Word of the Charleston blockade reached London within weeks, carried by fast packet ships whose captains had witnessed the unprecedented spectacle of a pirate fleet, bringing an entire city to its knees. The reports that reached the Admiralty and the Board of Trade painted a picture of colonial authority in complete collapse, with pirates exercising sovereignty over American waters, while His Majesty's government stood helplessly by. The response from London was swift and decisive. Orders were issued for a comprehensive campaign against piracy in American waters, with particular emphasis on the capture or destruction of Blackbeard and his fleet. Naval squadrons were reinforced, colonial governors were given expanded authority to deal with the pirate threat, and substantial rewards were offered for information leading to the apprehension of the most notorious pirate captains. More ominously for Blackbeard's future, the Charleston operation had demonstrated that piracy had evolved beyond simple robbery into something approaching organized rebellion against imperial authority. This realization transformed the official response from routine law enforcement into something resembling a military campaign against an existential threat to British control of the seas. As the summer of 1718 progressed, Blackbeard found himself at the center of a rapidly changing strategic situation. His success at Charleston had made him the most famous pirate in the world, but it had also made him the primary target of every naval force and colonial government in the Atlantic. The very achievement that had elevated him to legendary status had also set in motion the forces that would ultimately destroy him. The months following the Charleston triumph were a paradox of power and peril for Edward Teach. He had achieved something no pirate before him had ever accomplished. Yet that very achievement had painted a target on his back that would never fade. As his fleet sailed away from Charleston's harbour in late May of 1718, the smoke from the city's frustrated guns still visible on the horizon, Blackbeard understood that he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The immediate aftermath of the blockade saw a dramatic shift in how pirates were perceived throughout the colonial world. No longer were they viewed as mere criminals or opportunistic raiders. Blackbeard had demonstrated that organized piracy could challenge the fundamental structures of imperial commerce and governance. Colonial newspapers, when they dared to report on the Charleston affair at all, struggled to find language adequate to describe what had occurred. But for Blackbeard himself, the victory brought unexpected complications. The success at Charleston had attracted attention not just from governments and naval authorities, but from pirates throughout the Caribbean, who saw in his achievement a new model for their own ambitions. His anchorage at Nassau became a gathering place for every ambitious cutthroat and would-be pirate captain in the region, men who sought to bask in his reflected glory or to challenge his preeminence. Managing this influx of followers and rivals required all of Blackbeard's political skills. Some of the new arrivals were valuable additions to his force, experienced sailors with useful skills and proven loyalty. Others were little more than murderous opportunists who threatened the discipline and cohesion that had made his recent success possible. The delicate task of sorting between these categories, of incorporating the useful while excluding the dangerous, occupied much of his attention during the summer months of 1718. The logistical challenges of maintaining a large pirate fleet were also becoming increasingly apparent. Queen Anne's Revenge and her consorts required constant maintenance, enormous quantities of supplies, and secure harbours where repairs could be conducted without interference from hostile forces. The traditional pirate haven of Nassau, while still nominally beyond the reach of effective governmental control, was becoming less secure as colonial authorities began to coordinate their anti-piracy efforts. More troubling still were the reports that reached Blackbeard's ears about the changing attitudes of colonial governments toward piracy in general and toward him in particular. The pardons and accommodations that had once been available to pirates willing to abandon their profession were being withdrawn or made conditional on terms that few self-respecting pirates could accept. The unofficial tolerance that had allowed places like Nassau to exist as pirate republics was giving way to a new determination to root out piracy wherever it might be found. These developments forced Blackbeard to confront a fundamental question about his future. He could continue his current course, accepting the risks that came with his newfound notoriety, while seeking to exploit the opportunities that his reputation created. Alternatively, he could seek some form of accommodation with a legitimate authority, trading his current freedom for a degree of security and legal protection. The decision was complicated by the diverse opinions within his own organization. Some of his most trusted lieutenants argued for a more aggressive approach, suggesting that the success at Charleston should be followed by even bolder operations against major colonial ports. Others counseled caution, warning that continued escalation would inevitably provoke a response that even Blackbeard's formidable abilities could not withstand. The debate was further complicated by intelligence reports about the naval forces being assembled against him. British warships that had been scattered across the Caribbean on routine patrols were being concentrated into hunting squadrons with the specific mission of tracking down and destroying pirate vessels. These ships carried experienced crews, powerful armaments, and most importantly, official authorization to pursue pirates wherever they might flee. Even more concerning were reports about the new governors being appointed to key colonial positions. These men were not the typical political appointees who had previously filled such roles, but experienced military officers with specific instructions to eliminate piracy from their jurisdictions. They came armed with expanded legal powers, adequate financial resources, and most dangerously, the political will to use both effectively. As autumn approached, Blackbeard made a decision that surprised many of his followers and shocked his enemies. Rather than continuing his defiant course or seeking a dramatic final confrontation with the forces arrayed against him, he chose a third option that reflected both his strategic intelligence and his understanding of the changing political landscape. In September of 1718, Edward Teach, the man known throughout the Atlantic world as Blackbeard, formally requested a royal pardon from Charles Eden, the governor of North Carolina. It was a move that seemed to contradict everything he had fought for, yet it represented perhaps the most sophisticated political calculation of his entire career. North Carolina in 1718 was very different from the other American colonies. It was sparsely populated, weakly governed, and geographically isolated from the main centers of imperial authority. Governor Eden himself was a pragmatic politician who understood that effective governance sometimes required unofficial accommodations with forces that could not be easily suppressed. The colony's long coastline, broken by numerous inlets and sounds, provided perfect hiding places for vessels whose owners preferred to avoid official scrutiny. Most importantly, North Carolina's economy was still developing, and the colony could benefit significantly from the wealth that successful pirates brought to its ports. The goods that Blackbeard's fleet had captured during their Caribbean operations represented valuable commodities that could stimulate local commerce, while the pirates themselves were potential customers for colonial merchants and suppliers. The negotiations for Blackbeard's pardon were conducted with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his military operations. Rather than simply surrendering and hoping for mercy, he approached Governor Eden as one political leader negotiating with another. The terms that emerged from these discussions reflected the mutual benefits that both sides hoped to derive from the arrangement. Blackbeard would receive a full royal pardon for all his previous acts of piracy, along with official recognition as a legitimate privateer authorized to attack the shipping of nations hostile to Britain. In return, he would base his operations in North Carolina waters, contributing to the colony's economic development, while providing an unofficial naval defense against foreign threats. The arrangement satisfied Governor Eden's need to demonstrate that he was dealing effectively with the pirate threat, while providing him with a powerful ally whose presence would discourage other pirates from operating in North Carolina waters. For Blackbeard, it offered the prospect of continuing his maritime career within the bounds of legality, while maintaining most of the freedom and authority he had enjoyed as an outlaw. The formal ceremony in which Blackbeard received his pardon took place in Bathtown, North Carolina's colonial capital, in November of 1718. It was a remarkable event that symbolized the complex political realities of colonial America, where the boundaries between legal and illegal activity were often blurred by practical necessity and local circumstance. Blackbeard appeared at the ceremony in his finest captured clothing, his famous beard carefully groomed and his weapons polished to a brilliant shine. But the theatrical elements that had made him so feared as a pirate were now employed in service of respectability, creating an image of reformed criminals seeking to make amends for past transgressions. Governor Eden, for his part, presented the occasion as a triumph of civilized governance over barbarous lawlessness. In his official proclamation, he praised Blackbeard's decision to abandon piracy and emphasized the benefits that the colony would derive from having such an experienced mariner serving in its defense. The reality, of course, was far more complex than either man's public statements suggested. Blackbeard had no intention of abandoning the profession that had made him wealthy and famous, merely of conducting it under official sanction. Governor Eden understood this perfectly well, but he also understood that a reformed pirate operating under his authority was preferable to an uncontrolled pirate operating in defiance of it. The months that followed Blackbeard's official pardon represented a unique period in the history of American piracy. For the first time, one of the most notorious pirates of the age was operating with something approaching legal authority, licensed by a colonial government to continue many of the same activities that had previously made him an outlaw. This new status brought both opportunities and constraints. Blackbeard could no longer attack British shipping with impunity, as such actions would violate the terms of his pardon and his new commission as a privateer. However, the vessels of Spain, France, and other nations hostile to Britain remained legitimate targets, and the Caribbean still offered abundant opportunities for profitable operations. More significantly, his new legal status provided him with access to colonial ports and markets that had previously been closed to him. The goods captured during his privateering operations could now be sold openly in North Carolina's ports, while his crews could enjoy shore leave without fear of arrest or prosecution. The arrangement also provided Blackbeard with a degree of political protection that he had never enjoyed as a pure outlaw. Governor Eden's support, while unofficial and carefully limited, nonetheless represented a form of legitimacy that complicated any efforts by other colonial authorities to move against him. But the transition from pirate to privateer also created new tensions within Blackbeard's organization. Some of his followers embraced the change, welcoming the security and respectability that came with official sanction. Others chafed at the restrictions that their new status imposed, longing for the complete freedom they had enjoyed during their purely piratical days. These internal tensions were exacerbated by the practical challenges of operating under official oversight. Governor Eden, while sympathetic to Blackbeard's situation, was still accountable to his superiors in London for the conduct of anyone operating under his authority. This meant that Blackbeard's operations had to be conducted with a degree of discretion and legal justification that had been unnecessary during his outlaw period. The winter months of 1718 and early 1719 saw Blackbeard struggling to adapt to these new realities while maintaining the loyalty and discipline of his crews. The balance between his official duties as a privateer and his unofficial activities as a barely reformed pirate required constant attention and careful management. During this period, he established a base of operations in Ocracoke Inlet, a shallow waterway on North Carolina's Outer Banks that provided perfect protection for his vessels while remaining accessible to the Atlantic shipping lanes where profitable targets might be found. The inlet's shifting sandbars and treacherous currents made it nearly impossible for large naval vessels to enter, while its multiple channels provided numerous escape routes if pursuit should develop. From this secure base, Blackbeard conducted a series of operations that carefully skirted the boundaries of legality. Spanish vessels were captured and their cargoes confiscated under the authority of his privateer commission. French ships were searched for contraband goods that might justify their seizure. Even vessels flying British colours were occasionally stopped and inspected, ostensibly to verify their nationality and the legitimacy of their papers. These operations generated substantial profits while maintaining the fiction of legal authority. The captured goods were sold in North Carolina's ports, with appropriate portions of the proceeds forwarded to Governor Eden as evidence of the colony's newfound prosperity. The Spanish and French governments lodged protests with British authorities, but these were dismissed as the natural complaints of nations whose own shipping was being legitimately targeted by authorized privateers. For a brief period, it seemed that Blackbeard had achieved the impossible, a way to continue his profitable maritime career while enjoying the protection of legal authority. His reputation, rather than being diminished by his accommodation with colonial government, seemed to be enhanced by the political sophistication he had demonstrated in negotiating his new status. But this delicate balance could not be maintained indefinitely. The other colonial governors, particularly those whose jurisdictions had suffered from Blackbeard's previous depredations, viewed Governor Eden's arrangement with deep suspicion and growing alarm. They understood that legitimizing even a reformed pirate set a dangerous precedent that could encourage others to follow the same path. More significantly, the British naval commanders charged with suppressing piracy in American waters refused to recognize the distinctions between pirates and privateers that Governor Eden found so convenient. From their perspective, Blackbeard remained a dangerous criminal whose continued activities threatened the security of British shipping, regardless of whatever legal fig leaf he might have obtained from a colonial governor. The tension between these competing viewpoints came to a head in the spring of 1719, when reports reached London of Blackbeard's continued activities in North Carolina waters. The Board of Trade, already suspicious of Governor Eden's unorthodox approach to the piracy problem, demanded a full accounting of the arrangement and an explanation of why one of the world's most notorious pirates was being allowed to operate under official sanction. Governor Eden's response, while diplomatically phrased, essentially defended his arrangement as a practical necessity that served the colony's interests while eliminating a significant threat to regional security. He argued that a reformed Blackbeard operating under his authority was preferable to an uncontrolled pirate operating in defiance of all authority. This explanation failed to satisfy London's concerns, particularly when it was accompanied by reports from other colonial governors describing continued piratical activities by vessels associated with Blackbeard's organization. The Board of Trade began to pressure Governor Eden to revoke his arrangement with the former pirate, while naval commanders were given increasingly explicit instructions to treat Blackbeard as a legitimate target, regardless of his official status. These developments created an impossible situation for all concerned. Governor Eden could not simply abandon an arrangement that was bringing significant benefits to his colony without losing face and credibility. Blackbeard could not accept the further restrictions that London's pressure might require without essentially abandoning the maritime career that had made him wealthy and powerful. The naval commanders could not ignore their instructions to suppress piracy simply because one pirate had obtained questionable legal protection from a colonial governor. As summer approached, the fragile accommodation that had seemed to offer a solution to the Blackbeard problem was beginning to unravel. The political pressures that had made the arrangement possible were shifting, and new forces were emerging that would ultimately make its continuation impossible. The most significant of these new forces was Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia, who had been watching the North Carolina arrangement with growing alarm and determination to act. Unlike Governor Eden, Spotswood was a career military officer with extensive experience in dealing with irregular warfare and unconventional threats. He understood that the Blackbeard problem could not be solved through political accommodation, but would require decisive military action. Spotswood's assessment of the situation was based on a clear understanding of the broader implications of allowing Blackbeard to continue operating under any form of official sanction. From his perspective, the North Carolina arrangement represented not a solution to the piracy problem, but a dangerous precedent that would encourage other pirates to seek similar accommodations with colonial authorities. More importantly, Spotswood recognized that Blackbeard's continued presence in American waters posed a direct threat to Virginia's commercial interests and maritime security. The reformed pirates' base at Ocracoke Inlet was positioned to intercept shipping bound for Virginia's ports, while his reputation and resources made him a potential rallying point for other pirates seeking to establish themselves in the region. During the summer of 1719, Spotswood began to develop plans for a military operation that would resolve the Blackbeard problem permanently. Unlike the previous efforts to suppress piracy through routine naval patrols, this would be a targeted campaign designed specifically to locate and destroy Blackbeard's organization, regardless of whatever legal protections he might claim. The planning for this operation reflected Spotswood's military background and his understanding of the unique challenges involved in hunting pirates in the complex waterways of the North Carolina coast. Conventional naval vessels were too large and unwieldy to operate effectively in the shallow sounds and narrow inlets where Blackbeard had established his base. What was needed was a force of smaller, more maneuverable vessels that could pursue the pirates into their own territory and engage them on equal terms. A Spotswood solution was to organize an expedition of shallow draft sloops manned by volunteers from the Royal Navy and armed with light cannons that would provide adequate firepower while maintaining the speed and agility necessary for operations in coastal waters. The command of this force would be given to Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a young naval officer with a reputation for aggressive tactics and personal courage. The selection of Maynard for this crucial mission was itself significant. Unlike the senior captains who typically commanded anti-piracy operations, Maynard was young, ambitious, and willing to take the personal risks that a successful assault on Blackbeard's stronghold would require. He understood that this mission represented an opportunity to make his reputation and advance his career, but he also understood that failure would likely mean death at the hands of the most feared pirate of the age. As autumn approached, the preparations for what would become known as the Battle of Ocracoke entered their final phase. Spotswood had obtained the necessary authorizations from London, assembled his forces, and developed detailed plans for an operation that would either eliminate the Blackbeard threat permanently or result in a devastating defeat that would embolden pirates throughout the region. Blackbeard, meanwhile, remained at his base in Ocracoke Inlet, apparently unaware of the storm that was gathering against him. His latest operations had been successful, his crews remained loyal, and his arrangement with Governor Eden seemed to provide adequate protection against official interference. The intelligence network that had served him so well during his purely piratical days had apparently failed to detect the careful preparations being made for his destruction. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not only Blackbeard's fate, but the future of piracy in American waters. The man who had once held Charleston hostage and forced colonial governments to negotiate with him as an equal was about to face the most serious challenge of his extraordinary career. The intelligence that should have warned Blackbeard of his approaching doom was compromised by the very success that had made him legendary. His network of informants, which had once extended throughout the Caribbean and along the American coast, had been disrupted by the changing political landscape that followed his accommodation with Governor Eden. Many of the tavern keepers, merchants, and minor officials who had previously supplied him with crucial information were now reluctant to maintain such dangerous associations with a man whose legal status remained ambiguous. More critically, Blackbeard's own confidence in his political arrangement had made him less vigilant about potential threats. The months of operating under official sanction had created a false sense of security that dulled the survival instincts that had kept him alive during his purely piratical days. He had grown accustomed to conducting his business in the open, to sailing his vessels without constant fear of pursuit, to sleeping soundly in his cabin without posting the elaborate watches that had once been routine precautions. This complacency was perhaps most evident in his choice of anchorage during the autumn of 1719. Rather than maintaining his vessels in a state of constant readiness for flight, Blackbeard had allowed Queen Anne's Revenge and her consorts to settle into a comfortable routine at Ocracoke Inlet. The ships were careened for maintenance, their crews were granted extended shore leave, and the elaborate preparations for immediate departure that had once characterized every pirate base were allowed to lapse. The inlet itself, while providing excellent protection against conventional naval attack, had become something of a trap for vessels whose commanders had grown careless about maintaining escape routes. The same shallow waters and shifting sandbars that made it difficult for enemy ships to approach also made it challenging for Blackbeard's own vessels to depart quickly if the need arose. What had once been a strategic advantage was gradually becoming a potential liability. Blackbeard's personal life during this period also reflected his growing confidence in his reformed status. He had married a local woman, establishing a household in Bathtown that provided him with the trappings of respectability he had never enjoyed during his outlaw years. This domestic arrangement, while offering certain pleasures and conveniences, also created new vulnerabilities that his enemies might potentially exploit. The crew that remained with Blackbeard during this transitional period represented a mixture of his most loyal followers and newer recruits who had been attracted by his reputation and his apparent success in legitimizing his profession. Some of these men had sailed with him since his early days under Benjamin Hornigold's command, sharing his evolution from ordinary pirate to legendary commander. Others were recent additions who understood little of the complex political forces that were shaping their captain's fate. This diversity of experience and loyalty within his organization created subtle tensions that Blackbeard's enemies hoped to exploit. The veteran pirates chafed at the restrictions imposed by their captain's new legal status, while the newer recruits sometimes questioned whether they had joined a legitimate privateering operation or an elaborate charade that might collapse at any moment. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Lieutenant Robert Maynard was putting the finishing touches on his preparations for what he understood would be the defining mission of his naval career. The two sloops under his command, HMS Pearl and HMS Lime, had been stripped of unnecessary equipment and fitted with additional small arms and boarding equipment. Their crews had been carefully selected from volunteers who understood the dangers they would face and the importance of the mission they were undertaking. Maynard himself spent long hours studying every available piece of intelligence about Blackbeard's base at Ocracoke Inlet. He pored over captured charts, interviewed former prisoners who had been held there, and consulted with local pilots who knew the treacherous waters of the North Carolina coast. His planning was meticulous, taking into account everything from tidal conditions to the likely positions of Blackbeard's sentries. The lieutenant understood that success would depend not only on tactical superiority, but on achieving complete surprise. Blackbeard's reputation was built partly on his ability to avoid unfavorable encounters, and any warning of approaching danger would likely result in the pirates' escape to some new refuge, where the pursuit would have to begin again. The entire operation therefore depended on reaching Ocracoke Inlet without detection and engaging Blackbeard's forces before they could organize an effective response. Governor Spotswood's role in these preparations was crucial but necessarily discreet. His official authorization for the mission had to be carefully worded to avoid creating diplomatic complications with North Carolina's government, while his financial support had to be provided through channels that would not compromise the operation's secrecy. The governor understood that he was essentially authorizing an armed incursion into another colony's territory, an action that could create serious political problems if it were not completely successful. The legal justifications for the operation were complex and somewhat questionable, relying on broad interpretations of Spotswood's authority as a royal governor, and on the argument that Blackbeard's continued piratical activities had voided whatever protection his North Carolina pardon might have provided. These arguments would undoubtedly be tested in the aftermath of the operation, but Spotswood was confident that success would validate whatever legal risks he was taking. As October drew to a close, the final intelligence reports reaching Maynard confirmed that Blackbeard remained at Ocracoke Inlet, with a reduced force that appeared to be in a relatively relaxed state of readiness. The timing seemed perfect for an assault, with weather conditions favorable for the approach and tidal schedules that would allow his shallow draft sloops to navigate the inlet's treacherous waters. The departure from Virginia was conducted with the utmost secrecy, with Maynard's vessels slipping away from their moorings in the pre-dawn darkness of November 17th, 1719. The crews had been sworn to secrecy about their destination and mission, though the preparations for combat made it clear to everyone involved that they were embarking on something far more dangerous than a routine patrol. The voyage south along the coast required careful navigation to avoid detection by any vessels that might carry word of their approach to Blackbeard's lookouts. Maynard kept his ships well offshore during daylight hours, moving closer to the coast only under cover of darkness. The weather remained favorable, with light winds and calm seas that allowed the sloops to maintain good speed while minimizing the risk of being spotted from shore. As they approached the North Carolina coast, Maynard's crews made their final preparations for battle. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, boarding equipment was checked and positioned, and the men were briefed on the specific tactics that would be employed once they reached their target. The lieutenant emphasized the importance of taking Blackbeard alive if possible, both for the intelligence he might provide and for the symbolic value of bringing such a notorious pirate to trial. The approach to Ocracoke Inlet began before dawn on November 18th, with Maynard's vessels feeling their way through the outer channels by the light of a waning moon. The complex navigation required constant attention to depth soundings and careful observation of the subtle current patterns that marked the safe passages through the barrier islands. Any mistake could result in grounding on the shifting sandbars that had claimed numerous vessels over the years. The first light of dawn revealed the masts of Blackbeard's vessels anchored deep within the inlet, apparently unaware of the approaching danger. Maynard could see the distinctive silhouette of Queen Anne's Revenge, along with two smaller sloops that completed the pirate squadron. Smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily from the ships and from the temporary shelters that had been erected on the nearby shore, suggesting that the pirates were going about their normal morning routine without any awareness of the threat approaching from the sea. For Maynard, this moment represented the culmination of months of planning and preparation. Everything now depended on maintaining the element of surprise long enough to close with the enemy and force a decisive engagement. The shallow waters that protected Blackbeard's anchorage would also limit the pirates' ability to maneuver, potentially neutralizing the superior seamanship that had allowed them to escape from previous encounters with naval forces. The lieutenant gave the signal for his vessels to advance into the inlet, their crews standing ready at their battle stations as the distance to their legendary quarry steadily decreased. The morning sun was beginning to burn off the coastal mist, revealing more details of the pirate base and confirming that Blackbeard's force was indeed in the relaxed condition that intelligence reports had suggested. But aboard Queen Anne's Revenge, the first stirrings of alarm were beginning to manifest among the crew members who had been assigned to morning watch duty. The approaching sloops flew British naval ensigns, but their presence in these remote waters at such an early hour was unusual enough to warrant attention. A lookout called softly to his companions, pointing toward the inlet's mouth, where the strange vessels were becoming more clearly visible against the brightening sky. The alert spread quickly through Blackbeard's small fleet as men emerged from their hammocks and shelters to observe the approaching ships. The pirate captain himself appeared on Queen Anne's Revenge's quarterdeck, his famous beard catching the morning light as he raised a spyglass to study the intruders. What he saw there sent a chill of recognition through his experienced mariner's soul. These were not the lumbering ships of the line that usually comprised British anti-piracy patrols, but purpose-built vessels designed specifically for operations in shallow coastal waters. Their clean lines and business-like appearance suggested professional naval crews rather than the mixed companies of regulars and pressed men who typically manned routine patrols. Most ominously, their deliberate approach into the inlet demonstrated a knowledge of local waters that could only have been acquired through careful intelligence gathering. In that moment of recognition, Edward Teach understood that his years of successful evasion and political maneuvering had finally come to an end. The forces arrayed against him represented not another routine patrol that could be avoided or intimidated, but a dedicated hunting expedition specifically organized for his capture or destruction. The comfortable world he had created at Ocracoke Inlet was about to become a battlefield where his legendary reputation would face its ultimate test. The realization brought with it a strange sense of relief mixed with anticipation. For months, Blackbeard had been living in a state of suspended animation, neither fully legitimate nor completely outlaw, constrained by political considerations that conflicted with his fundamental nature. Now, faced with an unmistakable military threat, he could return to the element in which he had always excelled: pure combat stripped of diplomatic niceties and legal complications. His voice, when it rang out across the water, carried all the authority and menace that had made him the terror of the Caribbean. Commands flowed from his lips with practiced efficiency as his crews scrambled to prepare their vessels for action. Anchors were weighed, sails were set, and the great guns were run out in preparation for what everyone understood would be a fight to the death. Queen Anne's Revenge began to move through the shallow waters of the inlet, her experienced crew handling her with the skill that came from years of operating in similar conditions. But the approach of Maynard's sloops had caught them at a disadvantage, with escape routes limited by the geography of their chosen refuge and time running short to organize an effective response. The battle that was about to commence would be unlike any previous encounter in Blackbeard's remarkable career. This would not be a raid against helpless merchants or a running fight against pursuing warships, but a close-quarters engagement between professional fighting men in waters too shallow for maneuver and too confined for escape. Everything that had made Edward Teach legendary would be tested in the crucible of combat against an enemy specifically trained and equipped to destroy him. As the distance between the opposing forces continued to shrink, both commanders made their final preparations for an encounter that would determine not only their personal fates, but the future of piracy in American waters. The sun climbed higher in the November sky, burning away the last wisps of morning mist and revealing in stark detail the arena where legend would meet reality in the most decisive naval engagement of the pirate age. The morning air was thick with tension as both fleets maneuvered through the treacherous waters of Ocracoke Inlet. Blackbeard's vessels, despite being caught at a disadvantage, began to demonstrate the seamanship that had made them legendary. The pirates knew these waters intimately, every sandbar and hidden current, every shallow passage that could trap an unwary pursuer or provide an avenue of escape. Maynard's sloops, however, had been specifically chosen and modified for exactly this type of engagement. Their shallow drafts allowed them to follow the pirates into waters where conventional naval vessels could never venture, while their professional crews maintained the disciplined formations that regular training had drilled into them. The lieutenant himself stood calmly on his quarterdeck, his spyglass trained on the distinctive figure of Blackbeard, as the distance between the opposing forces steadily decreased. The first shots of the engagement were fired by Queen Anne's Revenge as she attempted to reach the deeper water near the inlet's mouth. Her great guns spoke with a thunderous roar that echoed off the low islands surrounding the anchorage, sending iron balls whistling toward Maynard's approaching sloops. The range was still long for accurate gunnery, and the shots fell harmlessly into the churning waters between the vessels. But the sound of those guns carried a significance that transcended their immediate military impact. For the first time in months, Blackbeard was fighting without the protection of legal sanction or political accommodation. He was once again purely and simply a pirate, relying on nothing but his own skill and the loyalty of his crew to survive the encounter. The theatrical elements of his persona, the smoke-wreathed beard and the elaborate costume, seemed suddenly less important than the cold realities of seamanship and gunnery. Maynard's response was measured and professional. His gunners held their fire until the range had closed sufficiently to ensure accuracy, then replied with a disciplined broadside that sent splinters flying from Queen Anne's Revenge's hull. The lieutenant had trained his crews extensively in the techniques of close-quarters naval combat, and their superior gunnery began to tell almost immediately. The confined waters of the inlet worked both for and against the opposing forces. While they limited Blackbeard's ability to use his superior local knowledge to escape, they also forced Maynard's sloops to approach in single file, exposing each vessel in turn to the concentrated fire of the pirate squadron. The tactical situation was complex, with neither side enjoying a clear advantage in the opening phases of the engagement. As the battle developed, the character of both commanders became clearly evident. Blackbeard fought with the desperate fury of a man who understood that defeat meant death, his voice rising above the thunder of the guns as he exhorted his crews to greater efforts. His presence on the quarterdeck, seemingly oblivious to the enemy fire that splintered the deck around him, inspired his men to fight with a determination that surprised even Maynard's professional sailors. The lieutenant, by contrast, maintained the cool composure, that marked the trained naval officer. His commands were crisp and clear, his movements deliberate and economical. He understood that this engagement represented more than just another anti-piracy operation. It was a test of whether disciplined professionalism could triumph over the wild courage and desperate cunning that had made Blackbeard legendary. The intensity of the fighting increased as the opposing vessels closed to point-blank range. At such distances, the great guns became less important than the smaller weapons that could be brought to bear more quickly and accurately. Swivel guns mounted on the ship's rails began to sweep the enemy decks with deadly loads of grapeshot, while sharpshooters in the rigging tried to pick off officers and gun crews with their long muskets. It was during this phase of the battle that the first serious casualties began to mount on both sides. Maynard's professional sailors, despite their training and discipline, found themselves facing an enemy whose desperation made them extraordinarily dangerous. The pirates fought with the ferocity of cornered animals, knowing that surrender would mean the gallows and that their only hope lay in complete victory. The turning point came when one of Maynard's well-aimed broadsides struck Queen Anne's Revenge at the waterline, sending a torrent of seawater pouring into her hull. The great ship, which had served as Blackbeard's flagship through so many triumphant campaigns, began to list heavily as her crew struggled to control the flooding. The damage was severe enough to limit her maneuverability significantly, trapping her in the shallow waters where Maynard's sloops could bring their concentrated fire to bear. Recognizing that his flagship was doomed, Blackbeard made a decision that revealed both his tactical brilliance and his understanding of piratical warfare. Rather than attempting to save Queen Anne's Revenge, he ordered his remaining vessels to close with the enemy sloops for boarding actions. In the confined waters of the inlet, where seamanship and gunnery provided only limited advantages, the outcome would be decided by cold steel and personal courage. The order to prepare for boarding was received with wild enthusiasm by Blackbeard's crews. These men had signed on for a life of violence and adventure, and the prospect of hand-to-hand combat against the Royal Navy's finest represented exactly the kind of challenge they had sought when they chose the pirate's life. Cutlasses were sharpened, pistols were loaded, and boarding axes were distributed as the pirates prepared for the climactic phase of the engagement. Maynard, observing the pirates' preparations, understood immediately what Blackbeard intended. The lieutenant had studied accounts of previous encounters with pirates, and he knew that their greatest advantage lay in the fierce, individual combat skills that regular naval disciplines sometimes struggled to match. His own crews were well trained and properly equipped, but they lacked the desperate motivation that drove men who fought with nooses already around their necks. The lieutenant's response demonstrated the tactical innovation that had brought him to Spotswood's attention. Rather than accepting the boarding action that Blackbeard desired, he ordered most of his crews below decks, leaving only skeleton gun crews visible to the approaching pirates. The deception was designed to convince Blackbeard that the naval sloops had suffered heavier casualties than was actually the case, encouraging the pirates to board what they believed to be weakened vessels. The stratagem worked perfectly. As Blackbeard's remaining sloop closed with Maynard's flagship, the pirate crews prepared for what they expected to be a relatively easy victory over a decimated enemy. The famous captain himself stood in the bow of his vessel, his smoke-wreathed figure clearly visible as he prepared to lead the boarding action personally. The moment when the vessels came together was one of extraordinary violence and confusion. Grappling hooks flew through the air, binding the ships together in a deadly embrace, while pirates swarmed over the rails with cutlasses gleaming in the morning sun. For a brief instant, it seemed that Blackbeard's desperate gamble might succeed as his men spread across the enemy deck, apparently facing only token resistance. Then, Maynard sprang his trap. At his signal, the concealed crew members burst from their hiding places below decks, transforming what had seemed like a pirate victory into a carefully planned ambush. The naval sailors, fresh and uninjured, fell upon the surprised pirates with disciplined fury, their superior numbers beginning to tell as the boarding action developed into a series of individual duels across the blood-slicked deck. The fighting that followed was as savage as any in the annals of naval warfare. Pirates and sailors grappled with cutlass and pistol, boarding axe and marlinspike, in a desperate melee where quarter was neither asked nor given. The confined space of the ship's deck became a charnel house as men fought and died within arm's reach of their enemies. At the centre of this maelstrom stood Blackbeard himself, fighting with the fury of a man who understood that his legend and his life hung in the balance. His great cutlass swept in deadly arcs around him, cutting down any sailor who came within reach, while his booming voice continued to encourage his men, even as the tide of battle began to turn against them. The theatrical elements of his persona seemed to fall away, revealing the core of genuine courage and skill that had made him legendary. Maynard, recognizing that the battle's outcome might well depend on the fate of the pirate leader, pressed through the melee with his own sword drawn, seeking a personal confrontation with the most notorious pirate of the age. The lieutenant understood that Blackbeard's death or capture would likely break the morale of his remaining followers, ending the engagement decisively in favor of the naval forces. The two commanders met near the center of the deck, their swords clashing in a duel that seemed to embody the larger conflict between lawful authority and piratical rebellion. Blackbeard fought with the desperate skill of a man whose entire career had prepared him for this moment, while Maynard relied on the disciplined technique that represented the best traditions of the Royal Navy. The duel was brief, but decisive. Blackbeard, weakened by multiple wounds and exhausted by the prolonged fighting, finally succumbed to Maynard's sustained attack. The great pirate fell to the deck of the enemy vessel, his famous beard matted with blood, his legendary career ending in the shallow waters where it had seemed he might find safety. The death of their captain broke the spirit of the remaining pirates, who quickly surrendered to Maynard's victorious crews. The Battle of Ocracoke was over, ending not just Blackbeard's life but an entire era in the history of American piracy. The man who had once held Charleston hostage and negotiated with colonial governors as an equal lay dead on the deck of a Royal Navy sloop, his dreams of maritime empire extinguished forever. Maynard, standing over his fallen adversary, felt none of the triumph that might have been expected from such a victory. The lieutenant understood that he had not simply defeated another pirate, but had brought to an end one of the most remarkable careers in the annals of maritime history. Edward Teach had been many things during his extraordinary life: sailor, privateer, pirate, and briefly, a legitimized commander operating under official sanction. But above all, he had been a man who refused to accept the limitations that society had tried to impose upon him. The aftermath of the battle saw Maynard's crews working to secure their prisoners and salvage what they could from the wrecked pirate vessels. Queen Anne's Revenge, the flagship that had carried Blackbeard through so many triumphant campaigns, settled slowly into the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet, her career as the terror of the seas ending in the same waters where her captain had sought refuge from his enemies. The lieutenant ordered Blackbeard's head to be severed and hung from his sloop's bowsprit as proof of the pirate's death, and as a warning to any others who might be tempted to follow his example. It was a grisly trophy, but one that carried enormous symbolic significance in the ongoing war against piracy in American waters. Word of Blackbeard's death spread quickly along the colonial coast, carried by the same network of merchants, sailors, and tavern keepers who had once spread tales of his exploits. The reaction was complex and varied, reflecting the complicated relationship that colonial society had maintained with the pirate who had both terrorized and fascinated them. In Charleston, the news was received with relief and satisfaction by the merchant community that had suffered under Blackbeard's blockade. The city's authorities, who had been forced into the humiliating position of negotiating with a pirate as though he were a legitimate head of state, felt vindicated in their belief that accommodation with such outlaws was ultimately futile. In North Carolina, Governor Eden found himself in a difficult position as news arrangement with Blackbeard, which of the battle reached Bathtown. His had seemed to offer a practical solution to the piracy problem, was now revealed as a dangerous miscalculation that had provided shelter to a man who remained fundamentally committed to his outlaw profession. The governor would face serious political consequences for his role in legitimizing one of history's most notorious pirates. But perhaps the most significant impact of Blackbeard's death was felt among the pirate communities that had looked to him as a symbol of what their profession could achieve. His success at Charleston had demonstrated that pirates could challenge the fundamental structures of imperial authority, while his brief legitimization in North Carolina had suggested that accommodation with governmental power might be possible. His death shattered both illusions, making it clear that the age of the great pirate captains was coming to an end. The surviving members of Blackbeard's crews faced the grim reality that their captain's death had brought upon them. Some were hanged as pirates, their bodies left to rot in chains as warnings to other potential outlaws. Others, deemed less culpable or more cooperative, received pardons in exchange for information about pirate operations throughout the region. A few managed to escape during the confusion that followed the battle, disappearing into the anonymous world of ordinary sailors and eventually abandoning their piratical careers. Stade de Bonnet, the gentleman pirate who had briefly served under Blackbeard's command, met his fate several months later when he was captured by South Carolina authorities and hanged in Charleston. His execution marked the end of another chapter in the Golden Age of Piracy, removing one of the last major figures who had operated during the era's peak years. The physical remnants of Blackbeard's maritime empire were quickly dispersed. Queen Anne's Revenge was stripped of anything valuable before being abandoned to the shifting sands of Ocracoke Inlet, where she would remain hidden for centuries until archaeologists rediscovered her remains. The treasure that Blackbeard had accumulated during his years of piracy was never found in its entirety, leading to persistent legends about hidden caches buried on remote islands throughout the Caribbean. Lieutenant Maynard returned to Virginia as a hero, his victory over Blackbeard establishing his reputation as one of the Royal Navy's most effective anti-piracy commanders. Governor Spotswood, who had authorized the mission, found his own political position strengthened by its success, demonstrating that determined colonial leadership could address threats that had seemed beyond the reach of conventional authority. The broader implications of Blackbeard's defeat extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory that Maynard had achieved. The death of such a notorious and successful pirate sent a clear message throughout the maritime world that the Golden Age of Piracy was indeed coming to an end. The combination of determined governmental action, improved naval coordination, and the elimination of safe havens was making the piratical profession increasingly untenable. Colonial authorities, encouraged by the success of Spotswood's initiative, began to coordinate their anti-piracy efforts more effectively. The informal tolerance that had allowed places like Nassau to exist as pirate republics was replaced by systematic campaigns designed to root out piratical activity wherever it might be found. Naval patrols were increased, intelligence networks were expanded, and the legal frameworks for prosecuting pirates were strengthened. The economic factors that had originally encouraged piracy also began to change as the colonial economies matured and legitimate opportunities for maritime employment increased. The desperate poverty that had driven men like Edward Teach to sea in search of alternatives to legal drudgery was gradually being alleviated by expanding trade and more rational labor practices. Perhaps most importantly, the romantic appeal of the piratical life was being undermined by the harsh realities that Blackbeard's death had revealed. The man who had seemed to embody the possibility of complete freedom from societal constraints had ultimately been brought down by the same forces of law and order that governed ordinary men. His legend would survive and even grow in the centuries that followed, but his death marked the end of piracy as a viable alternative to conventional maritime careers. The transformation of Edward Teach from ordinary sailor to legendary pirate to dead criminal represented more than just one man's rise and fall. It embodied the broader tensions of an age when the boundaries between legal and illegal activity were often blurred by practical necessity and political expediency. His story illuminated the complex relationships between authority and rebellion, between order and chaos, that characterized the early development of colonial America. In the years that followed his death, Blackbeard's reputation underwent a gradual transformation from historical reality into romantic legend. The man who had once terrorized the shipping lanes of the Atlantic became the subject of countless stories, songs, and eventually books and films that emphasized his theatrical persona while obscuring the harsh realities of his actual career. This legendary Blackbeard bore little resemblance to the historical Edward Teach, but he served important cultural functions that helped explain the persistence of his fame. He represented the appeal of absolute freedom in an increasingly regulated world, the attraction of living entirely by one's own rules without regard for social conventions or legal constraints. He embodied the romantic notion that individual courage and determination could triumph over institutional power and established authority. But beneath the romantic overlay, the real story of Edward Teach remained as a testament to the complex forces that shaped the early Atlantic world. His career illustrated how economic desperation could drive ordinary men to extraordinary measures, how political weakness could create opportunities for those willing to operate outside conventional boundaries, and how the absence of effective governmental authority could allow individual charisma and tactical skill to achieve remarkable, if temporary, success. The waters off the North Carolina coast, where Blackbeard had met his end, gradually returned to their normal patterns of commerce and navigation. Ships passed safely through Ocracoke Inlet without fear of piratical attack, their captains and crews secure in the knowledge that the most feared predator in American waters had been permanently eliminated. The age of the great pirate captains was drawing to a close, but the legends they had created would endure long after the last of their black flags had been hauled down in defeat. As night falls over these same waters centuries later, it's easy to imagine the ghost of Queen Anne's Revenge still riding at anchor in the shallows, her spectral crew forever preparing for battles that will never come. The man they called Blackbeard may have found his final rest in the cold depths of the Atlantic, but the story of Edward Teach continues to sail on, carried forward by the eternal human fascination with those who dare to live entirely by their own rules, no matter what the cost may be. The death of Edward Teach sent ripples across an ocean that had known his presence for so many turbulent years. In the taverns of Port Royal and the coffee houses of Boston, in the counting houses of London and the plantation mansions of Virginia, men spoke in hushed tones of the end that had come to the most notorious pirate of their age. Some felt relief, others a strange sense of loss, as if something vital and dangerous had been drained from their world. But perhaps nowhere was Blackbeard's death felt more profoundly than among the scattered communities of pirates who still haunted the Caribbean waters. These men had looked to him not merely as a successful colleague, but as proof that their chosen profession could rise above mere banditry to challenge the very foundations of imperial power. His blockade of Charleston had shown them what organized piracy could accomplish. His brief legitimization in North Carolina had suggested that accommodation with authority might be possible. His violent end shattered both dreams in a single morning's bloody work. The psychological impact rippled outward from crew to crew, carried by the same informal networks that had once spread tales of Blackbeard's exploits. In Nassau, where the great pirate republic was already crumbling under pressure from reformed governors and increased naval patrols, the news accelerated the process of dissolution. Captains who had once spoken boldly of establishing permanent bases and challenging colonial authority began to reconsider their positions. Some chose the path of accommodation, seeking pardons from governors who were now more willing to negotiate from positions of strength. Others simply melted away into the anonymous world of legitimate maritime commerce, their piratical careers ending not with dramatic final battles, but with quiet resignations to conventional fate. A few of the most desperate or deluded continued their predatory activities, but they lacked both the vision and the organizational skills that had made Blackbeard's operations so effective. The colonial governments, meanwhile, found themselves dealing with the unexpected consequences of their victory. The elimination of Blackbeard had removed a major threat to maritime commerce, but it had also eliminated what had inadvertently become a stabilizing force in the piratical world. The great captain's presence had attracted many smaller operators into his orbit, concentrating piratical activity in areas where it could be more easily monitored and contained. With Blackbeard gone, these lesser pirates scattered like startled birds, spreading their activities across a much wider area and making them far more difficult to track and suppress. Colonial authorities found themselves dealing not with one major threat that could be addressed through concentrated effort, but with dozens of smaller ones that required constant vigilance and scattered resources. Governor Alexander Spotswood, basking in the acclaim that followed his successful elimination of the Blackbeard threat, soon discovered that victory brought its own problems. The other colonial governors, while publicly congratulating him on his achievement, privately resented the precedent he had set. His willingness to authorize military operations in another colony's territory raised uncomfortable questions about the boundaries of gubernatorial authority and the proper procedures for dealing with intercolonial problems. More troubling still were the diplomatic complications that arose from the mission's success. The Spanish and French governments, while having no love for pirates, were disturbed by the implications of Virginia's unilateral action. If colonial governors could authorize armed expeditions wherever they deemed necessary, what was to prevent similar operations from being launched against legitimate foreign commerce under the pretext of anti-piracy enforcement? These concerns found their way into official protests lodged with British authorities in London, where the Board of Trade found itself in the uncomfortable position of defending actions that it had not authorized, and that raised serious questions about colonial discipline and imperial chain of command. The successful elimination of a notorious pirate was clearly a good thing, but the methods employed to achieve that success created precedents that could prove troublesome in the future. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, the hero of Ocracoke Inlet, faced his own complex aftermath in the wake of his triumph. His defeat of Blackbeard had indeed made his reputation within the Royal Navy, earning him rapid promotion and the respect of his professional colleagues. But it had also made him a marked man among the remaining pirates who saw him as the symbol of their profession's decline. The lieutenant found himself assigned to increasingly dangerous missions as naval commanders sought to exploit his proven expertise in anti-piracy operations. His success against Blackbeard had demonstrated that even the most notorious pirates could be brought to bay through proper planning and determined execution, and every colonial governor with a piracy problem began to request his services. This constant exposure to danger took its toll on both Maynard and his crews. The men who had sailed with him to Ocracoke Inlet became legends in their own right, their exploits celebrated in waterfront taverns throughout the colonies. But fame brought unwanted attention from enemies seeking revenge, and several of Maynard's veterans found themselves targeted by pirates who saw them as symbols of everything they had come to hate about the changing maritime world. The physical evidence of Blackbeard's defeat was carefully preserved and displayed as proof of the pirates' destruction, and as a warning to others who might be tempted to follow his example. The severed head that Maynard had hung from his bowsprit was eventually transferred to a pole at the entrance to Hampton Roads, where it remained for years as a grisly landmark that greeted every vessel entering Virginia's waters. This macabre trophy became a pilgrimage site of sorts, drawing curious visitors from throughout the colonial region who wanted to see the remains of the man who had once held Charleston hostage. Sailors would point it out to their passengers. Tavern keepers would spin elaborate tales about the battle that had produced it, and children would dare each other to approach close enough to touch the pole that supported it. But the head was more than just a curiosity or a tourist attraction. It represented the triumph of organized authority over individual rebellion, of law over lawlessness, of civilization over chaos. Its presence at such a prominent location sent a clear message to anyone who might be contemplating a career in piracy. This is how such careers inevitably end. The search for Blackbeard's treasure began almost immediately after news of his death spread throughout the colonies. Despite the fact that his known wealth had been largely dissipated through the normal processes of piratical economics, persistent rumors suggested that he had hidden substantial caches of gold and silver on various islands throughout the Caribbean. These treasure hunts became something of an obsession for certain adventurous individuals who convinced themselves that they could succeed where others had failed. Armed with crude maps allegedly drawn by former members of Blackbeard's crew, equipped with shovels and an abundance of optimism, they scoured the beaches and forests of countless islands in search of chests that probably never existed. The futility of these searches did nothing to dampen the enthusiasm of the searchers or the credulity of those who financed their expeditions. The legend of buried pirate treasure had taken root in the colonial imagination, and no amount of failure could entirely destroy the belief that somewhere, on some forgotten island, Blackbeard's gold lay waiting for the lucky discoverer who could decipher the secrets of its location. More serious efforts were made to track down the legitimate assets that Blackbeard had accumulated during his brief period of legal respectability in North Carolina. His house in Bathtown was searched thoroughly. His business associates were questioned extensively, and his financial records were examined with the kind of attention usually reserved for major commercial frauds. These investigations revealed the extent to which Blackbeard had succeeded in integrating himself into colonial society during his months under Governor Eden's protection. He had invested in local businesses, established credit relationships with merchants, and even contributed to charitable causes in ways that suggested a genuine desire to build a legitimate life for himself. The discovery of these conventional activities complicated the simple narrative of irredeemable criminal brought to justice that colonial authorities preferred to promote. It suggested that Edward Teach had been capable of transformation, that his piratical career might have been a response to circumstances rather than an expression of fundamental character flaws. This more complex picture of Blackbeard's character was largely suppressed in the official accounts of his career and death. Colonial authorities had no interest in promoting the idea that pirates were capable of redemption, or that their criminal activities might be responses to legitimate grievances against established society. The story they preferred to tell was one of simple good versus evil, with law-abiding citizens triumphing over irredeemable criminals through courage and determination. The surviving members of Blackbeard's organization faced varying fates, depending on their perceived importance and their willingness to cooperate with colonial authorities. The most senior officers, those who had participated in planning major operations or who were deemed to have particular influence over their subordinates, were generally hanged after brief trials that focused more on establishing their guilt than on exploring the circumstances that had led them to piracy. Lesser crew members, particularly those who could demonstrate that they had been pressed into service or who provided useful intelligence about other piratical operations, were more likely to receive pardons or reduced sentences. Colonial authorities understood that these men often possessed valuable knowledge about the locations of other pirate bases, the identities of merchants who had dealt with pirates, and the operational methods that had made piratical enterprises successful. The interrogations of captured pirates provided colonial governments with the most detailed intelligence about piratical operations that they had ever possessed. For the first time, authorities gained comprehensive insights into the internal workings of pirate crews, the methods by which they recruited new members, the techniques they used to convert captured vessels for their own purposes, and the networks of contacts that enabled them to dispose of stolen goods. This intelligence proved invaluable in subsequent anti-piracy operations. Naval commanders could now anticipate piratical tactics with greater accuracy. Colonial governors could identify and close the commercial networks that had sustained piratical operations, and customs officials could recognize the subtle signs that indicated when seemingly legitimate merchants were actually dealing in stolen goods. The broader economic impacts of Blackbeard's elimination were felt throughout the Atlantic trading system. Insurance rates for vessels operating in American waters dropped significantly as underwriters recognized that the removal of such a notorious pirate had substantially reduced the risks facing legitimate commerce. Shipping schedules became more predictable as captains no longer needed to plan circuitous routes to avoid known pirate hunting grounds. Colonial ports that had suffered under piratical pressure experienced immediate economic benefits. Charleston, in particular, saw a dramatic increase in shipping activity as merchants who had avoided the port during Blackbeard's blockade returned to take advantage of its strategic location and excellent harbour facilities. The psychological impact of the pirate's death was almost as important as the actual reduction in threat levels, but the economic changes went deeper than simple risk reduction. The elimination of major piratical operations removed what had been, in effect, a significant source of economic disruption and uncertainty. Merchants could now make long-term plans with greater confidence. Investors were more willing to finance ambitious trading ventures, and colonial governments could focus their resources on development rather than defense. The legal precedents established by the campaign against Blackbeard also had lasting implications for colonial governance and imperial administration. Governor Spotswood's willingness to authorize military operations beyond his own territorial jurisdiction, while successful in this particular case, raised questions about the proper limits of colonial authority that would resurface repeatedly in the decades leading up to the American Revolution. The coordination between different colonial governments that had made the anti-Blackbeard campaign possible also established patterns of intercolonial cooperation that would prove important in dealing with other regional challenges. The success of joint action against a common threat demonstrated that the American colonies could work together effectively when their interests aligned, a lesson that would have profound implications for their eventual relationship with imperial authority. Meanwhile, in the waters where Blackbeard had met his end, life gradually returned to normal rhythms. Fishing boats ventured out from the barrier islands without fear of being seized by pirates seeking supplies or recruits. Merchant vessels passed through the sounds and inlets that had once been Blackbeard's hunting grounds, their captains no longer scanning the horizon for the distinctive silhouette of Queen Anne's Revenge. The physical remains of the great pirate ship settled deeper into the sandy bottom of Ocracoke Inlet, gradually being covered by shifting sediments that would preserve her for future generations to discover. Her cannons, scattered across the shallow bottom, became homes for marine life that had no knowledge of the violence they had once dispensed. The timbers that had carried Blackbeard through so many triumphant campaigns slowly dissolved into the salt water that had been both his highway and his grave. Local watermen, those hardy souls who made their living from the treacherous waters of the North Carolina coast, began to tell stories about the battle they had witnessed. These tales, embellished with each retelling, gradually took on the character of local folklore, preserving memories of the day when the most feared pirate in American waters had finally met his match in the shallow waters they knew so well. Children born in the years following Blackbeard's death grew up hearing these stories, learning to associate the waters around Ocracoke Inlet with both danger and heroism. The battle became part of the local historical consciousness, a defining moment that separated the wild, lawless days of the early colonial period from the more settled era that followed. As the years passed and memories of the actual events began to fade, the story of Blackbeard's last battle took on increasingly legendary characteristics. The historical Edward Teach was gradually transformed into a figure of almost supernatural menace and power, while Lieutenant Maynard became the heroic representative of law and order, triumphing over chaos and criminality. These evolving legends served important cultural functions, providing colonial society with symbolic narratives that helped define their collective identity and values. The story of Blackbeard's rise and fall became a cautionary tale about the consequences of rejecting social norms, while Maynard's victory represented the triumph of disciplined courage over undisciplined violence. But beneath the legendary overlay, the historical reality remained as a testament to the complex forces that had shaped the early Atlantic world. Edward Teach's career had illuminated the tensions between individual ambition and social order, between economic desperation and legal constraint, between colonial autonomy and imperial authority. His death marked the end not just of one man's extraordinary career, but of an entire era in which such careers had been possible. The Golden Age of Piracy that had flourished in the power vacuum following the War of Spanish Succession was drawing to a close. The same forces that had made Blackbeard's success possible, weak colonial governments, inadequate naval patrols, and abundant opportunities for predatory activity, were being systematically addressed by imperial authorities who had finally recognized the threat that organized piracy posed to their Atlantic empire. In the decades that followed, piracy would never again achieve the level of organization and success that Blackbeard had demonstrated. The scattered pirates who continued to operate in American waters lacked both his vision and his ability to coordinate large-scale operations. They remained dangerous to individual vessels and small communities, but they never again posed the kind of systematic threat to imperial commerce that had made Blackbeard's name synonymous with maritime terror. The transformation was gradual, but inexorable. Colonial governments became more effective, naval patrols became more systematic, and the economic opportunities that had driven desperate men to piracy began to expand through legitimate channels. The harsh world that had created Edward Teach was slowly giving way to a more ordered society, where such extreme responses to social and economic pressure were no longer necessary or viable. Yet even as the conditions that had made the Golden Age of Piracy possible were disappearing, the legends created during that remarkable period continued to grow and evolve. The stories of Blackbeard and his contemporaries became part of the cultural heritage of the Atlantic world, preserved in songs and stories that celebrated their courage while condemning their methods. These legends served as both entertainment and instruction, providing audiences with thrilling tales of adventure while reinforcing social messages about the importance of law and order. They allowed people to experience vicariously the excitement of a life lived entirely without conventional constraints, while avoiding the inevitable consequences that such a life entailed. The enduring fascination with Blackbeard's story reflected deeper human needs and desires that transcended the specific historical circumstances of his career. In an increasingly regulated world, his example represented the eternal appeal of absolute freedom. In an age of growing institutional power, his defiance of authority resonated with anyone who had ever chafed under unwanted control. But perhaps most importantly, his story embodied the tragic appeal of the doomed hero, the man who reaches for greatness and achieves it briefly before being brought down by forces beyond his control. Edward Teach had risen from the anonymous of the most famous men masses of ordinary sailors to become one of his age, only to fall victim to the same violence that had elevated him. As the night deepens over the waters where these events unfolded so long ago, we can imagine the spirits of all those who participated in this drama still moving through the darkness. Blackbeard himself, his great beard streaming in an ethereal wind, forever commanding ghostly crews in battles that echo across the centuries. Lieutenant Maynard, still standing at his post, eternally vigilant against threats that no longer exist. The countless sailors on both sides who gave their lives in pursuit of dreams they would never see fulfilled. Their stories have become part of the eternal human narrative. Tales of ambition and courage, of desperation and redemption, of the eternal struggle between order and chaos that defines our existence. In the gentle lapping of waves against distant shores, in the cry of seabirds wheeling overhead, in the whisper of wind through rigging that exists now only in memory, their voices continue to speak to us across the vast expanse of time. The age of the great pirates may have ended with Blackbeard's death in those shallow waters off North Carolina, but the questions their lives raised about freedom and authority, about justice and survival, about the price of dreams and the cost of defiance, remain as relevant today as they were in that distant autumn when the most notorious pirate in history finally met his fate. In the cold embrace of the sea, he had ruled so briefly and so completely. And so we come to the end of our long journey through the life and times of Edward Teach, the man history remembers as Blackbeard. In these quiet hours, as darkness settles over the waters where his story reached its violent conclusion, we can reflect on what his extraordinary career reveals about the nature of ambition, the price of freedom, and the eternal human struggle against the constraints that society places upon us. The tale we have followed tonight is more than just the biography of a single pirate, remarkable though his exploits certainly were. It is a window into an entire world that existed at the margins of civilization, where desperate men made desperate choices, and where the line between hero and villain was often determined by nothing more than the flag under which one sailed. In Edward Teach's transformation from ordinary sailor to legendary pirate captain, we see reflected the dreams and nightmares of an age when the very boundaries of the possible seem to shift with every tide. His story speaks to something deeper in the human experience, that restless hunger for significance that drives men to risk everything in pursuit of glory. The young sailor, who once hauled on ropes for a few shillings a month, became a figure whose name was spoken in whispers from London to Charleston, whose black flag could empty harbours, and whose death required the combined efforts of multiple colonial governments to accomplish. In achieving this transformation, he proved that even the most humble origins need not define the limits of what a determined individual might accomplish. Yet for all his success, for all the wealth he accumulated, and the fear he inspired, Edward Teach could never entirely escape the world he had rejected. The same society whose rules he had abandoned continued to shape his fate, and the same forces of law and order that he had defied eventually found the strength to destroy him. His brief experiment in legitimacy under Governor Eden's protection revealed both his longing for respectability and his inability to abandon the profession that had made him famous. Perhaps that is the most haunting lesson of all from Edward Teach's remarkable life. That even the most successful rebellion against society's constraints carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The very forces that allowed him to rise from obscurity to legend were the same ones that would eventually bring him down. In choosing to live entirely by his own rules, he discovered that no man, however powerful or cunning, can indefinitely escape the tide of history that sweeps us all toward our appointed end. And so tonight, as you drift towards sleep with the sound of these words still echoing in your mind, remember that the waters where Blackbeard met his fate continue to whisper his story to anyone willing to listen. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of the past.